April 1943. In the burning heat of a forgotten North African tent, three German women, Greta, Leisel, and Magda, stood clutching each other, sunburned and exhausted, in a moment that would rip apart everything they thought they knew. They weren't soldiers, just radio operators, clerks, support staff swept up by World War II's chaos. Propaganda back home had promised them one thing: enemy captivity meant death or worse. But right from the start, something was wrong. A British officer strolled by, speaking flawlessly in German, not a tourist's accent, not a garbled attempt, but perfect German, like a native. Greta's blood ran cold. Was this a trick? Was this some psychological game, a setup designed by the enemy to break their minds before anything physical began? It was the first crack in the wall of lies they'd been fed since childhood. The British, they'd been told, were monsters, prone to brutality, known for torture, execution, and unspeakable abuses, especially for women caught in uniform. Yet in this dusty makeshift tent, so far from home, none of those dark warnings seemed real. Instead, confusion set in. The three women, who wore the uniform of the enemy, whispered nervously. If the British were supposed to be savages, why did they speak their language so naturally? Was this some shadow operation led by German defectors, or was the world far stranger than they had ever imagined? The doubts grew louder when not a single threat was made, and not a hand was raised in violence. They'd been told to expect rage and dehumanization, women captives used and discarded, their fates never to be spoken of. Instead, their captors acted with cold efficiency, cataloging names and handing out numbers, but not brutality. The old terrors, fueled by speeches and posters, began to flicker like ghosts and die. But the silence about their fate said enough. Greta tried to stay calm for the sake of the others, but her mind churned. If even one part of the Nazi propaganda was wrong, how much else was a lie? Leisel, just a teenager from the Bavarian countryside, clung tight to Greta, her whole world already unraveling before her eyes. Even Magda, the oldest and calmly skeptical, had no answers. The one thing they all understood: nothing about this strange, new captivity made any sense at all. The story they'd been told was crumbling, and what was about to come next would be more unnerving and more transformative than they could imagine. But that was only the beginning. Days blurred into one another inside the holding camp, but the real shock came at sunrise, just as rumors started swirling among the prisoners. Greta, Leisel, and the others were ordered onto waiting trucks, British guards silent except for sharp commands and roll calls. The vehicles rattled down dirt roads toward the coast, the North African air thick with dust, fear, and questions nobody dared ask out loud. What waited for them at the water's edge was nothing like the nightmare they'd pictured: no rusty barges or shadowy prison ships. Instead, the HMS Empress of Canada loomed over the dock, a massive ocean liner built to carry luxury travelers across the Atlantic. Gone were the velvet seats and champagne, but the ship itself radiated power. Greta's first thought was simple: we're being shipped to some fate worse than death. Stepping aboard, the women braced for punishment: cold, dark holds, iron bars, filth, hunger. Instead, a British sailor, barely older than Leisel, guided them down echoing stairwells to small but oddly comfortable rooms. Beds with springs, white sheets folded neatly, real soap, running water. It was unimaginable. For women who had slept on the ground for months, the mattress felt like a piece of heaven snuck into captivity. But one thing truly shattered their expectations: food. 3 full meals, real meals served at set times every single day. The dining hall buzzed with conversation, the air spiced with actual butter, bread, and fish. Greta's stomach twisted in knots, not from fear any longer, but from wondering, how is this possible? British guards grumbled that the rations were boring. It was almost comical. For the German women, who'd spent months stretching crumbs into meals, the sight of boiled potatoes and canned peaches on a metal tray was a feast fit for a king. Over and over, the lies drilled into them back home dissolved in the face of these shocking truths. Nazis claimed the British were starving thanks to relentless U-boat attacks. But here, even the guards seemed well-fed, their boots thick and new, their uniforms crisp. No one threatened punishment if food went untouched. No punishments, no violence, just rules, routines, and the steady thrum of a ship steaming west across the open ocean. At night, the women lay on soft beds listening to the engines. Some wept for home, others stared at the ceiling, afraid to trust this new reality. Greta scribbled in her hidden diary, "They feed us more than our own army, they give us vitamins. Why?" Days later, during routine checkups, a British doctor handed out vitamin tablets, another bewildering luxury. In Germany, soldiers fighting on the hellish Russian front couldn't get medicine, let alone vitamins. Yet here, their enemies handed them out like candy. The Empress of Canada sailed on, indifferent to the confusion it carried below decks. Watching from the railing, Leisel overheard sailors complaining about the same food. Day after day, nothing changes. That night, Leisel lay in her bunk, quietly dumbstruck. In America, even the bored and the tired were living better than elite Nazi officers. Each morning, sunlight spilled onto deck walks where prisoners could breathe fresh Atlantic air and gaze toward a future unknown. But the sense of dread remained, shifted now from survival to the growing horror that the enemy was not at all as they'd been painted. As the ship neared its destination, a fresh wave of questions rolled in. What was waiting across the ocean? Would the kindness last, or was this all just an elaborate mind game? One thing was certain, every mile pulled them further from the world they thought they knew, and deeper into the most unnerving puzzle of all. The enemy that was supposed to destroy them was instead treating them better than their own homeland ever had. But even this surreal voyage wasn't the real shock. The real shock waited on the distant, unfamiliar shore of a country that seemed foreign in every way until it didn't. 3 relentless weeks at sea ended with the Canadian skyline rising above the mist, a sight more alien than anything the women could have imagined. The ship docked in Halifax, and the German prisoners, exhausted but alive, shuffled onto the pier, bracing for whatever cold reception awaited on this far shore. But as they stepped onto Canadian soil, nothing made sense. The docks weren't haunted by threats or shouts, just busy workers, orderly lines, and clean uniforms. Greta peered out the train window as the convoy wound west across endless forests, vast fields, neon-green towns. Everything was so staggeringly peaceful. No bomb craters, no blacked-out windows, no crowds of terrified civilians. It was a world untouched by war. Yet the true shock came in Kitchener, Ontario. The train hissed to a stop at a small wooden station. Greta pressed her face to the glass, expecting stares or jeers or worse, angry mobs. Instead, a man stepped onto the platform and spoke to all 847 German women, in flawless German. Not textbook phrases, but real dialect, familiar, warm, and sharp as a memory. The station sign was in German, the newspapers in kiosks printed side by side in German and English. The prisoners stared, numb with disbelief. Were they still dreaming? Had they somehow boomeranged back to Europe without realizing it? Signs on street corners bore names like Wilhelm and Frederick, clear markers of a German past alive and well in this foreign land. That moment shattered whatever certainty remained. Leisel clutched her friend's arm. Did the ship take us to the wrong continent? Around them, Canadian locals chatted in German, swapped jokes in English, mingled the two languages with carefree ease. Old men on benches whistled folk songs Greta's father once played back in Hamburg. Teenagers cursed about baseball and rations in a Bavarian accent. Instead of guards barking in foreign tongues, the German prisoners found themselves welcomed by their own language, their own foods, and echoes of the culture they'd been taught was under siege. Canadian women showed them to beds with thick mattresses. Local store signs, church boards, even bakery menus were written in 2 languages, like parallel worlds colliding where nobody cared about choosing sides. For the first time since capture, Greta felt the ground slipping from under her beliefs. The world as she knew it was gone, replaced by a confusing, parallel America, one that ate well, spoke German, and looked nothing like the land of enemy nightmares she'd been warned about. It wasn't just comfort that stunned them. It was identity. Who were they if their so-called enemies spoke just like their grandmothers, baked bread like their mothers, and mourned the same cities torn apart by war? On that train platform, under the unfamiliar Canadian flag, hundreds of women realized the borderlines drawn in blood were more fragile than anyone wanted to admit. But the most profound truths were hiding in plain sight. Because being German in Canada, they were about to discover, meant something entirely different than being German in Nazi Germany. Here, identities weren't weapons, and the most dangerous thing wasn't violence but kindness. And what they found next would utterly redefine everything they thought they knew about enemy and ally, truth and lies, power and freedom. What hit hardest was not just the absence of brutality, but the overwhelming presence of plenty. The world the German women stepped into felt surreal, almost like a high-budget movie set designed to showcase the American dream in real life. Every day became a study in disbelief. The assignments came fast. One by one, prisoners were parceled off not to backbreaking labor camps, but to places that by wartime German standards looked like palaces. Greta was sent to a sprawling modern meat factory, its machinery gleaming, its workers moving with easy confidence. The sheer scale staggered her. Industrial refrigerators the size of a Berlin apartment, electric saws, endless process lines, all humming with efficiency and order. The workers, many of them speaking German as fluently as English, treated her with a disturbing normalcy. They joked, they shared stories, they explained the machines in familiar dialects. Free sausages, real meat, rich spices on break, nobody counted rations, nobody seemed afraid of wasting food. Leisel, meanwhile, was sent to a rural farm owned by the Bauer family, her own last name by wild coincidence. The land stretched further than she could run, machines milked cows, cars outnumbered horses, a radio played jazz and baseball broadcasts every Sunday. Mrs. Bauer, a stern woman with kindness in her eyes, insisted on feeding Leisel until she was full. Full. That word felt like a fairy tale. Fresh bread, eggs, vegetables from gardens out back, butter rich and yellow as gold, luxuries she'd only dreamed of during the long war years. Magda, older and sharper, was assigned a post in the local hospital as a translator. She hovered in corridors filled with German-speaking Canadian patients, translating for doctors, learning about a society where identity wasn't written in fear. No one cared who you worshipped, what party you voted for, or what God you believed in. For Magda, the realization was like lightning in her chest. Here, being German is just a fact, not a threat, not a crime, not a loyalty test. That single jarring difference, that freedom to be both German and something more, became the undercurrent to every day. The prisoners gathered at night to whisper their discoveries. Electric fridges that never broke down, machines for every task, townsfolk so well fed they complained about too much meat, children who read in peace by electric light. Back home, the news screamed of Allied starvation and Canadian poverty, yet here every street, every shop window told a different story. The truth became impossible to ignore. Their enemies were living lives of ease and security, not crumbling under the weight of German might. The Nazi regime had pressed the women to believe their foes were starving, desperate, evil. But every day in Canada proved the propaganda more hollow, more desperate, more absurd. And the most disorienting piece? Over and over, Americans and Canadians didn't just treat the German women as labor. They treated them as guests, helped them with kindness rather than threats, answered frightened questions with patience. The simple, everyday gestures, the warm bed, the hot food, the neighborly good morning, felt like bombs dropped on the very structure of Nazi identity. Each night in the dormitories, the talk would always circle back to the impossible question: if this is real, what else did they lie about? And as Greta watched other women cry from confusion, not torment, she knew they were all teetering on the edge of a total transformation. The foundation of their world had turned to sand. But even this was only a prelude, because beneath all these small shocks, a single encounter would soon blow apart every defense, every excuse, every last lie the Nazi system had built inside them. And that story began the night the prisoners were invited to a gathering unlike any other, a night when music, food, and memories collided in a storm no propaganda could contain. Sometimes history doesn't change in a speech or a battle. Sometimes it happens on an ordinary night. In a hall filled with music and scents from a distant home. For Greta, Leisel, Magda, and the hundreds of German women POWs in Canada, that moment came when they were led under armed guard but with quiet courtesy to the city's iconic Concordia Club. What waited for them inside would shatter even their deepest convictions about war, enemy, and truth. To outsiders, it might have looked like a regular community event. But these were prisoners, guests, and one-time enemies gathered together at tables quietly set with white linens. All around the hall, German-Canadian families, Some with sons fighting overseas, some with memories of the old country, stood shoulder to shoulder with their so-called foes. The aromas that filled the air were a punch to the heart. Fresh schnitzel frying, bacon-laced sauerkraut, apple strudel dusted with sugar. Food that tasted like memory itself. At first, the German women barely dared to sit. Leisel clutched the edge of the bench as if it might vanish beneath her. Greta closed her eyes just to smell the butter. Magda, who'd witnessed more than her share of horrors, was struck speechless by the music, a folk song from her Berlin childhood played by a trio of local musicians. It was a world away from marching boots and the beat of distant bombers. Then a twist no one expected. A frail, white-haired Canadian man approached Greta and without hesitation greeted her in flawless Low German, her hometown dialect from Hamburg. "You remind me of my granddaughter. She's still back home. Is your family alive?" The shock was instant, overwhelming. Greta realized that across the room similar meetings were happening, prisoners and locals exchanging stories not of hate, but of missing loved ones, bombed-out cities, and hopes for peace. Tears, long held back by pride and fear, spilled over. Leisel found herself speaking with a Canadian woman barely older than herself, both waiting for letters from brothers, one fighting for Hitler, the other for freedom. Suddenly, enemy lines meant nothing. Pain and hope were universal. Two hands joined on the table, didn't care about uniforms. Even the guards faded into the background, transformed from sentries to silent witnesses of something profound. There was no violence here, no secret test, no trap, just the haunting realization everyone was waiting for word from home. Loss, longing, and worry had no nationality. When the music swelled and the crowd sang together, German lyrics harmonizing with Canadian accents, a collective ache was exposed. For the first time, the POWs saw that being German didn't mean standing with the regime. Here in this North American heartland, people held onto German songs, recipes, laughter. They'd left behind dictatorship and kept the best of what made them who they were. For Magda, the truth finally landed. The Nazi lie was not just about the enemy. It was about what Germans themselves could be, free, proud, and kind, away from the grip of hate. That night, hearts cracked wide open. Many German women cried into their beds, unable to explain the overwhelming mess of relief, grief, and shame. A quiet argument rippled through the dorms. Was this all some clever trick, or simply the truth at last revealing itself? But there was no going back. The damage to the old beliefs was done. Something powerful had been unleashed inside them. Empathy, curiosity, the dangerous wish to know what else might be possible beyond what they'd been taught to hate. That single night did what years of propaganda and war could not. It turned sworn enemies into neighbors and neighbors into something like family. The war was still raging overseas, but inside those walls, at least for an evening, the most powerful weapon was not force or fear, but simple, unexpected kindness. And what happened after would put every belief, every friendship, every scar from the past to the ultimate test. The morning after the Oktoberfest, St. Jerome's College was eerily quiet. The unlikely taste of home, real bread, savory meat, even a glass of homemade beer, still lingered on the lips of hundreds of German women who just months ago would have called these Canadians their sworn enemy. But if that night's kindness had cracked the wall of Nazi propaganda, the days that followed would send it tumbling down. What began as whispers in the dormitory spread like wildfire. Some women clung to what they'd witnessed, hospitality where they expected cruelty, understanding in the faces of enemies who grieved for the same cities, the same vanished pre-war life. These women couldn't ignore the evidence of their own senses: freedom, abundance, and tolerance thriving alongside German heritage right here in North America. Others saw a trap in every gesture. Was it possible the whole town was acting? Were they living on a movie set meant to break their morale before shipping them home as broken tools? The oldest, the true believers, huddled together at night, repeating half-remembered slogans. "Don't fall for it, it's all lies." They tried to keep Nazi rituals alive, even as the rest of the camp seemed to drift away from them day by day. But the truth had a way of splintering the camp into three. First, there were the transformers, women like Greta, who felt their identities melting away and something new forming in the ashes. They asked questions, read whatever Canadian books they could find, and tested the boundaries of this strange, open society. They marveled at the ease with which Canadians criticized their politicians or organized churches for every faith and every language. Then there were the resistors, determined to hold the line. Hilda Cross, a steadfast Nazi organizer, became their reluctant general in exile. Each night she tried to rally the old order, warning that kindness was just another weapon used to destroy the German soul. If Canada seemed prosperous, it must be a trick. If the people smiled, the smiles must hide some dark plot. Their loyalty had become a lifeline. If that snapped, what remained of the home they'd long since lost? And finally, caught in the swirling chaos, were women like Leisel, unsure, rattled, and quietly suffering. She watched Mrs. Bauer set a second helping of roast on her plate, speaking gentle words in soft Bavarian. Her mind rebelled against what her eyes confirmed. What if the truth was this simple? What if everything she'd endured, hunger, propaganda, the death of neighbors, had all been for nothing? Every day, these divisions sharpened. The dorms that once felt united in captivity became a patchwork of cliques, debates, and even shouting matches. Sometimes arguments erupted into tears or worse. "You're betraying the fatherland," would ring down the hall. "You're blind, we were lied to," came the answer. Yet the outside world kept intruding. Letters trickled in from ruined cities, Hamburg scorched to rubble, Berlin a skeleton. Canadian guards, many with German names themselves, confided news of relatives fighting on both sides of the Atlantic. Some women listened as local Canadians discussed church, politics, and freedom without fear of punishment, a concept utterly alien after years under Nazi control. Late at night, Greta took to writing in her diary. "We came here thinking strength meant obedience and unity. But here, strength is something else entirely, a quiet confidence born from questioning and choosing your own path." The greatest American lesson I witnessed by these women wasn't in rations or ration cards, but in the invisible pulse of freedom that ran through every aspect of life. It was freedom to argue, to doubt, to create a new, untidy, resilient self out of the wreckage of old certainties. But transformation came with a price. As more women broke away from the party line, abandoning once sacred rituals for honest questions, friendships fractured and old loyalties went up in smoke. The boundaries between us and them blurred forever, and the true cost of embracing the truth became clear. What none of them could imagine was that, in this unlikely place, where German met Canadian, where enemy lines dissolved overnight, their journey was only halfway done. Choices would be demanded, and each woman would have to decide whether to risk everything for a new life or return to the ruins of a world that no longer existed. The greatest battle wasn't against armies or nations. It was against their own past and the truth they could no longer deny. The guns finally fell silent. The announcement came on a crackling radio: Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. St. Jerome's College, once alive with debate and doubt, froze in a moment that felt both victorious and devastating. For months, the German women had lived suspended between worlds, but now the question loomed: where did they truly belong? With surrender came a choice more heartrending than any they had faced since capture. Canada, once the unimaginable enemy, offered them two futures. One, return to a Germany reduced to ashes, a country famed for its power now starving, shattered, and leaderless. Two, stay in Canada if they could find sponsors, jobs, and prove to the authorities that they posed no threat. It was a decision that split hearts as much as it split the group. Many, like Greta, felt compelled to go back. Home was still home, no matter the scars. Greta carried not just her belongings, but a battered diary filled with 2 years of revelations, a record of kindness from the enemy, of identities reborn through suffering and truth. She longed to see if her mother survived, to find any piece of her old life still standing. As she stood on Halifax's pier, the weight of leaving this strange, generous country pressed on her shoulders as heavily as the memory of bombs falling back home. Leisel chose a different path. In a twist straight out of a Hollywood story, the Bauer family, her wartime employers and surrogate kin, offered sponsorship, a job, and their hearts. The American promise of reinvention was now Canadian, but the echoes were unmistakable. Here, anyone might start again, regardless of where they'd come from. "You are part of our family now," Mrs. Bauer told her, voice thick with emotion. For Leisel, the warmth of Sunday dinners and the shining promise of fields ready for planting outweighed the ghosts of what she'd left behind in Bavaria. Magda, always the observer, embraced her new life with sharp-eyed pragmatism. She found work as a translator, helping refugees and newcomers find their footing in a free, open country. The Canadian hospital, once a workplace of exile, became her sanctuary. In Berlin, we loved our culture but obeyed orders, she wrote. Here, democracy is baked into daily life and criticism is not a crime. You can speak, doubt, and change. That is the greatest freedom of all. For those who returned, the homecoming was brutal. Greta found Hamburg in ruins, a city unrecognizable, populated by survivors measuring out life one Red Cross parcel at a time. Her mother, a shadow of the woman she remembered, wept when Greta arrived with Canadian food and stories of kindness from strangers. Greta realized the deepest American and Canadian lesson of all. You can go home again, but you can never erase what you have seen, tasted, or learned. Those who stayed forged new lives in North America. Many sponsored the next wave of immigrants, war refugees, and displaced persons, building a legacy of compassion from their own unlikely journey. They taught their children English, German, and above all, the value of questioning authority, cherishing democracy, and never taking freedom for granted. As the ships carried the rest of the women back to Europe, each carried more than letters and photographs. They carried living proof that kindness and dignity can break any chain. In the end, the true revolution was not fought on a battlefield but within each woman's heart through the slow, honest work of questioning, forgiving, and rebuilding. Many wrote home, urging friends and family to seek out America, seek out Canada, to start anew in a world that offered hope instead of division. Letters back from Germany spoke of starvation, loss, and regret, but also gratitude for the food, the memories, the chance, a slim but real chance to begin again somewhere beyond the ruins. They were no longer just prisoners or war survivors. They had become something bigger, witnesses to the hard truth that patriotism without humanity is a dead end, and that sometimes the greatest journey is across the borders of your own hardest beliefs.